Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Diego Lopez, and we're here back with another video on a critique to UNESCO's framework for assessing language endangerment. As you can see, UNESCO in its 2003 work on language endangerment delves into 9 different factors that allow us to assess such endangerment, which is great because typically people speak of languages as being very endangered, or not endangered at all. And that distinction is just too coarse-grained to be useful. So it's great that we have different factors that we can delve into as part of our analysis. Now, how do we define endangered? Well, according to UNESCO, an endangered language is a language that is on its path towards extinction. Now, there are at least a couple of problems with this notion. First, extinction, it's an organic metaphor that we're using in order to talk about languages. And what we have seen in other videos is that whenever we use organic or biological metaphors to talk about languages, what happens? We lose sight of the political and economic aspects that play into a language evolution, therefore naturalizing literally the history of that language. And so that's problematic. The other problematic aspect has to do with the fact that even if a language goes to absolute zero speakers, it can still be revitalized, as we will see later on in this video. Now, without further ado, the first factor, and this is a crucial one, is intergenerational transmission. To what degree is the language in question being passed from generation to generation? UNESCO establishes 5 levels. Number 5 is the safest, and number 0 is just extinct. Now, number 5, it can be safe, meaning the language is spoken by all generations, or stable yet threatened, meaning the language is actually spoken intergenerationally in most contexts, but there is a coexisting multilingualism which threatens some of the spaces in which this language is spoken. And then we have unsafe, which means that the intergenerational transmission of that language is limited to specific social domains, such as the home. Definitely endangered, which means that is no longer spoken as the first language at home. Severely endangered, which means that only the older generations speak it, as old as grandparents. Parents may have a passive understanding of it, but they typically don't use it, meaning they are not active in the usage of that language with their children. And then critically endangered is level 1, which means that it's only spoken by the great-grandparents post-vernacularly, meaning they might remember a word or a proverb, perhaps a song, but they do not speak the language fluently. And finally, extinct, right? Nobody either speaks the language or even remembers some of the words, expressions, etc. in that language. Now, the category extinct, as I said before, is problematic. Why? Now we get to understand why. Because in his work, Gilad Zuckerman distinguishes 3 levels of revivalistics. Reclamation, which means efforts towards reviving a no longer spoken language, as it happened, for instance, with Hebrew. Revitalization, which means trying to increase the health of a severely endangered language, for instance, Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, and reinvigoration, which is the work towards furthering a language that is, yes, endangered, but still features a high percentage of children who can speak that language. And so within reclamation, we can see that a language that is no longer spoken by anybody can nonetheless come to be spoken by somebody, meaning there is no such thing as language extinction, strictly speaking, right? And that's why Gilad Zuckerman speaks of sleeping beauties. He says, I use the term sleeping beauty, meaning a language that looks dead but is not, as a positive, poetic way to champion and celebrate these dormant tongues and to avoid the negative connotations of alternatives such as dead or extinct, such as UNESCO does, which are often rejected or rebuked by indigenous people. The second criterion is the absolute number of speakers of that language. It's obviously sometimes hard to calculate, but generally speaking, the more speakers, the better. Why? Because amongst other things, small populations are subject to disease, warfare, natural disasters, and/or assimilation. The third factor is the proportion of speakers within the total population. So the total population of a group will be the ethnic, religious, regional, or national group with which the speech community identifies, and then what proportion of those are speakers of the endangered language? Well, the language in question is safe, therefore not endangered, if all of them speak the language. Unsafe if nearly all of them do. Definitely endangered if only a majority of them does. Severely endangered if only a minority of it does. Critically endangered if very few speak the language. And extinct, quote unquote, if none speak the language. Now, trends in existing language domains. This is really important and is often overlooked. In what domains and for which functions is the language in question used? Well, if it's universally used for all domains and functions, then that's perfect. The next situation is the multilingual parity, meaning 2 or more languages are used in most social domains and for most functions, including the language we are assessing. Then comes dwindling domains, meaning the language we are assessing is used at home and for many functions, but is losing influence to the dominant language in the surroundings. Then we have a language spoken in limited or formal domains, meaning it's used only in a few of them, and many people can understand it, but do not necessarily have an active competence, do not necessarily speak that language. Then we have a situation where the language is only spoken in highly limited domains, only on special occasions and by a few individuals. And finally, extinct, quote unquote, which means it's not used in any domain for any function at all. Number 5, what is the response of that language to new domains and media? Think about the internet, for instance, which is not considered, unfortunately, in this guide because it wasn't really a thing back in 2003. The best ideal situation is where the response to new domains and media is dynamic, meaning the language in question is used in all new domains. Then we have active, when it's used in most domains, receptive, used in many domains, coping, is at least used in new domains. Minimal is only used in a few new domains. And finally, inactive is not used at all in any new domains. That is the worst possible situation. Obviously, with the explosion of the internet, that is really the media where you want to see your language spoken. And more than anything else, because the internet is not really a media, but rather a media of media. Right? We can watch TV, listen to the radio, etc. within the internet, which makes it more important than any individual media. Number 6 is materials for language education and literacy. How many of those materials are available and of what quality are those materials, right? Best situation is whenever you have an orthography, grammar, a dictionary, and the administration is also conducted in that language. Then comes a situation where you don't have administration being conducted in that language, but at least there are written materials and there's child literacy, therefore ensuring intergenerational transmission, or at least facilitating it. The next optimal situation is having written materials and child exposure, even if you don't have print media. Then there's a situation where we have written materials which are only useful to some, and there is no literacy education in the school curriculum. That's already fairly problematic. It's even worse if there's a practical orthography which is known, but only some written material, and the worst possible situation is where there is not even any orthography available. Number 7 is the governmental and institutional language attitudes and policies, including official status and use. This is incredibly important. If a language is a dialect with an army and a navy behind, if you don't have that army or that navy, then your language is doomed, pretty much. The best possible situation is that where all languages are protected, or that language in particular is protected, equal support. Then it comes differentiating support, meaning minoritized languages are protected, mostly in the private domain, and occasionally they are considered prestigious, so there are positive language attitudes towards it. The next one is passive assimilation. There is no explicit policy to protect the minoritized language, and the dominant one is also de facto official, right? As in English in the US. Then there is active assimilation, where there's no protection for the language you're interested in, and there is a government encouragement to assimilate into the dominant language. Then even worse is forced assimilation, meaning the dominant group language is the only official one, and there is no protection or recognition for the endangered language in question. And finally, there is prohibition. The minoritized or endangered language in question is prohibited, as it happens, for instance, in some dictatorships. Number 8, what are the attitudes of the community members themselves toward their own language, which is extremely important. Those languages can have a strong positive associations with cultural identity, or negative ones due to perceptions of hindrance to economic mobility and integration into mainstream society. Or I want to integrate in the mainstream society, therefore I need to drop my language. Or I want to move up in socioeconomic status, therefore I need to learn the dominant language and forget about this minoritized language. Those kind of things. Again, the best possible situation is if all members value their language and want to see it promoted. The next one is if most do, then if many do, even if others are indifferent, then if some do, even if others are indifferent, and then we come into very problematic situations if only a few value their language and want to see it promoted, and most are indifferent, and the worst possible case is if no one cares and everybody prefers to use the dominant language rather than the minoritized one. And finally, what is the type and quality of documentation of that language, right? The best possible scenario, number 5, if there are comprehensive grammars and dictionaries, extensive texts, and constant everyday media, if there is abundant high quality audio and video recordings that are properly annotated. That's ideal. Still pretty good if there is one authoritative grammar and some adequate notes, plus dictionaries, texts, literature, and some updated everyday media, plus high quality audio and video recordings which are properly annotated. It's fair if there are sufficient grammars, or even just one grammar, dictionary, and texts, even if there's no everyday media and audiovisual materials exists. Some are really good and others are not good at all. Then the next situation is already tricky, where we have a fragmentary type of documentation with only a few grammatical sketches, not really grammars per se, short word lists, and texts that are of limited range, and only audiovisual materials of varying quality, meaning maybe there are a few that are really good, but then the rest are meh, and most are probably bad. In the inadequate category, we have only a few grammatical sketches and short word lists. The texts that exist are of limited use, and so is the audiovisual material, which is probably not even annotated. And finally, we have undocumented languages where there are absolutely no materials whatsoever. In conclusion, I believe that UNESCO's guide, which I will put in the link below the video, is useful, particularly because it's fine-grained, which means rather than saying, oh yes, this language is endangered or is not, we have 9 different aspects according to which we can assess the degree of endangerment of that language. Maybe the language endangerment ranks highly in some categories but low in others. And in this fashion, we know what type of aspects do we need to emphasize or do we need to care the most for in order to revitalize that language. So this is definitely useful and positive for social change conducive to inclusivity. Now, there are 2 aspects that I'm worried about. The first one is that this guide is insufficiently critical, meaning there are language ideologies which are reproduced throughout the entire texts, including native speakerism, mother tongue, and the use of organic metaphors. If you don't understand any of these, please visit further videos in this channel. And the other big problem is that this guide is definitely outdated. It was published in 2003, meaning most of the legwork was already done by 2002, probably. And this is way before the explosion of Web 2.0. So here we do not see reflected any of the ways in which content on demand, for instance, different types of broadcasting, as in, say, YouTube, Twitch, etc., participatory interaction through Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and so on, let alone Web 3.0 platforms and AI apps or affordances. We do not see any way in which all of this has completely changed the landscape for language endangerment assessment. So consequently, some of the notions are updated. For instance, intergenerational transmission no longer needs to take place from grandparents to parents and then to children at home. Intergenerational transmission may take place on the internet across generation, but amongst people who do not belong to the same family or have never met in person before. Something equivalent happens with broadcasting. Before, prior to the internet, it was very important for how much time could you follow a broadcasting. For instance, if there was a program in the language you're interested in, which only was broadcasting 30 minutes per week. Now it doesn't matter with content on demand because you can replay that content indefinitely. So that leads to a different type of classification. That's all from me. Hope you found this video useful. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you have any suggestions for improvement concerning UNESCO's Guide for Language Endangerment. And as always, thanks for watching.